Welcome back to the Wise Up Podcast, brought to you by Open Water. My name is Chris Albrecht, and as always, I'm here to dish out a little business wisdom for you. And I am, well, let's see. I'm always excited to talk to my guests, but today I am envious. I am envious because I am talking with Greg Sherwin. And listen, he's got a lot of background in career tech. He's a career technologist, right? He's on the faculty at the Singularity University, helps out with faculty with other kinds of technology. Yeah. But the cool thing about Greg, one of many cool things, I should say, is that he picked up and moved over to Portugal. And so he is living that expat lifestyle. And so today we're going to talk about what it's like being an expat, in particular in Portugal, but just some things to think about. So first off, I don't know how to say welcome to the show in Portuguese, Greg, but I am so glad you're here.
Bem-vindo. You totally
go.
were. Yeah, bem-vindo.
I love it. All right. So let's do this real quick. How long have you been living in Portugal?
A little over 6 years now.
Okay.
And, yep.
And what brought you there?
It was interesting. My last role in the U.S., I was a vice president of engineering for Singularity University's headquarters in Mountain View. And I got a lot of global exposure. And having been working in the Silicon Valley area for a long time, I started to really feel this sort of insularity of it, whenever VCs do it, they're really good, but they'll come up with spreadsheets of 19 different ways to look at how do we make a food ordering app profitable and what do we invest in? And then you realize there's more that we could do with technology than just that. And so part of that is kind of what I came out here for leisure travel. The sort of dirty secret, which isn't the reason I came here, is my wife is born and raised in California, but she's Portuguese. Both her parents emigrated from the Azores, the islands in the middle Atlantic, and she spoke native Portuguese around the home and et cetera. And so we would go back. But when I visited here back in 2016, they had just gotten a few years out of what was their bond crisis era. If anybody remembers, in economic terms, there was something called PIGS, which was a derogatory term standing for Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, sometimes Ireland for a double I, in terms of countries that had bond debt levels that were really high after the financial meltdown. And so they had to really modernize their economy back to the wall. And one of the things I noticed, having not come back here in a while, was just, wow, they're starting to invest in entrepreneurship and modernize, doing startups. And I was just like, wow, suddenly I came through here saying, you know what? I maybe could find a way to do something productive career-wise, as well as live the dream life, as you were saying. It just so happened that after some time, I was winding down what I was doing in the US, and I considered looking here, did lots of networking, and then over time, just found myself getting more excited about I wouldn't call it greenfield, but it was a lot smaller. It was a different market, but just the whole different cultural perspective on technology and stuff. And just for where I was in my career, I kind of joked when you're in Silicon Valley doing tech, it's like seeing tech from another perspective is like kind of getting away from the sun to see the stars at night, And so in that sense, being here was like, oh, look at that, And so for me, that was just also at a point in my life where I was just looking for ways to just re-stimulate my brain and find things that would engage me, whether it was new languages, food, culture, as well as just sort of business environments.
Okay, so do you speak Portuguese?
Yes.
Okay,
I'm always learning. I'm always learning.
Sure. Okay, listen. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Did you speak it before going over there?
I spoke some. Probably my vocabulary was better than my grammar. I added a couple of verb tenses and kind of some things as I kind of done. But it's also interesting because it's always a tricky thing. I studied more Italian before that I learned my Portuguese, and Italian's, I don't know, it's just a little easier for me because everything is so phonetic. There's no, you don't say you spell this in Italian. And in Portuguese, though, much like in French and stuff, there's certain fractions, vowels get swallowed, things like that happen. So you have to have an ear for it, which sometimes takes some time to develop. But yeah, so.
Okay. So, all right. So you see, I don't want to divulge too much personal information here, right?
Sure.
But so was your wife, so did she have a Portugal passport?
Yes. She did.
Okay, so
That made
did
it
that
easier. I
make
didn't
the
have to do the whole golden visa thing. I just came as under the EU reunion visa, family reunion visa, which was here's somebody who's an EU citizen, their spouse is in the country, and that's how I basically established myself. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about that just because just because that's something that you know about, right? So if
Yeah.
someone has a spouse with an EU passport, what does that mean for you in terms of being able to find, go and work over in that country?
Yeah, I mean, there's one of the funny stories, and I'm going to quote it because it's a friend of mine joke because we talk about all the things. I want to be a balanced person about it. So I had a friend once who told me, I came from Portugal for the bureaucracy, and there's a little of that you get in Europe for sure, in some cases. And I think well, the process of getting sort of a tax ID, being able to set up a bank account, because what I was doing was different. A lot of people who come kind of take the digital nomad approach and would be like, just pay me in US dollars and we'll just ship it overseas. I'm only there for like 90 days. Here, I was actually trying to work in Portugal, pay Portuguese taxes, learn how to do their tax system online in Portuguese, and then also set everything up so that I could actually be working in a Portuguese company in culture and all that kind of stuff. It was a very the company itself is a bit very progressive based on sort of the traditional businesses here, but yeah, there was a few hurdles to get over in terms of being able to set it up. But there's a lot of like organizations or people that you socialize with, et cetera, that will help you navigate some of the early hurdles of being able to get yourself set up.
Got it. Okay. So you almost had, because the thing that I had always heard, the thing that always sort of stymied me was like, well, if you're an American trying to get a job in Europe, you face a really uphill battle. And I don't know what the stats was anymore. This was a long time ago, right? So it
Yeah,
sort of warded me off. And a lot of people had said at one point because it was because of the unemployment rate. So they really are looking for
true.
people in their own country to fill the jobs, and they don't want Americans coming over there. And this isn't to decry any kind of system. It was just the facts on
No,
the ground,
no,
right?
and with reasonable thing. I mean, I think about it going the other direction, right? So I came at a time, 2018, which was still a big growth time for them. And in fact, one of the reasons why I even went to the company I went with is they were very opportunistic about it. I actually was overqualified for a position I applied for. And they were like, why are you on this call? And I was basically, this is what I want to do. And they're like, we'll create something because you don't fit in this box. And they gave me the best answer, which was rather than saying, oh, you don't fit in this box, sorry, was maybe we need a different box, but this is interesting. And so I don't think that 3, 4 years later, given the sort of economic shifts, that they would have been able to do that. But at that time, it totally worked for me. And it gave me a landing pad to have like a company that was sponsoring me because my wife was an independent consultant, and even though she could speak the language and stuff here, it's still a big uprooting. And this is pre-COVID too, so like having clients in California when you're reporting in from Portugal is just sort of in some cases unheard of, depending on your business or industry. So, but that's changed, of course.
Okay. So what's the biggest question people ask you when they're thinking about moving or working abroad?
Biggest questions they ask me. Um, hmm.
It could be anything. Is it
Yeah,
like dealing with the government? Is it how do you
I think
grocery
some of
shop?
it's some
Like,
of the well, those are all really important questions. I was, because I was just thinking before this about some of the kind of prepared things. And I don't think it's especially. I'll go with the grocery shopping one, which is interesting because it's very much a learning experience because it's that classic thing of like you don't know you're in water as a fish until you're out of water kind of thing, where suddenly all the things you take for granted when you're living life about, oh, I need deodorant. Where do I go to get that? You'd be like, oh, in the US, there's a certain types of drugstores or supermarkets that might carry it, and kind of that you get to a first principles problem for all these basics, and you find out that, oh, it's not like that in the US. They have some other thing, or this one does it sometimes and that one doesn't. And so sometimes it's relearning, and I think as particularly coming from an American context, you also become acutely aware how overserviced we are as customers in terms of everything's really optimized for convenience. Buy this and anything you actually even want before you even know what you want at any time. So Amazon deliveries piling boxes on your driveways. It's not like that here. And in some ways, it's actually kind of good, because I forced myself to kind of get to know local vendors, small community things that had stuff, but there's always things that you couldn't find. And so you had to let go of just sort of your expectations of convenience that typically you would have in the US, and work and kind of lean into sort of the frameworks that were here. And some of it was great because, like COVID happened, suddenly I actually would know the people who operated these stores, and they would like, oh, see me, and they'd open a window and they'd give me something and whatever and stuff, as opposed to like, the only time I would actually get to know anybody is if I went to some nameless department store, or had everything delivered, online or something. So that was an interesting challenge. But I get questions, and it's funny because I usually get questions usually more around time of U.S. elections, but and you can understand why, about, hey, what does it take to actually go to like a place like Portugal, and what is it like? And so I get questions usually about, yeah, certainly about, like, what it's like to like, get a place to live. It's true. It's become much more challenging here. This has been a area that modernized its, liberalized its real estate market. There was a time maybe about 10, 15 years ago where everything was all rent controlled, but it led to all the horrible side effects of that, which was abandoned buildings. You had grandmothers maybe only paying 50 euros a month rent, but there was no incentive for the landlord to actually fix their plumbing, and so they had no running water. And so the downside, of course, in being able to liberalize it, yes, people started investing in properties, things got more expensive, and then all of a sudden, people who had very low incomes to start with here couldn't afford to live in the downtowns that all of a sudden became attractive, and so that's been a sort of a touchier issue. But yeah, so I'll get questions about that. I'll get questions about, I don't know, just usually stuff about that. I think one of the things that I think is a lesson I'll say that I wish, because we talked about different types of questions. One of my questions about something I wish I knew before I came here was how being an American, at least having a US citizenship, kind of brands you financially differently around the rest of the world. And one of the reasons is because the US is one of only, like, I think 7 countries in the world that will tax you everywhere you are, regardless of whether you're in the country or not. And there's some bilateral tax laws, so you don't get double tax, et cetera. But what it also has is there's things like something called FACTA in the US, which is like the Financial Accounting Tax Reporting Act or something like that. So the idea is, whether it's because of terrorism funding, or more likely the case, just knowing that you owe taxes, any financial institution that you work with will have to comply with FACTA. And that means reporting, like, say, if you got interest from a bank, it would be like they'd have to give you the equivalent of a 1099 and report it back to the US, because the US would expect that it would be on your income. What ends up happening is, because the penalties of not complying with FACTA is like, 20,000 euro fees for banks if they don't, is you end up in this situation where people are like, yeah, we have financial services, how can we help you? And then they find out you're a US citizen, and it's like, they kind of back off. It's very strange. I likened it to, say, what I imagine would be like if you were the ex-girlfriend of a mob boss on Tinder, where suddenly it'll be like, hey, you seem interesting, and all of a sudden they're like, oh, yeah, that's your phone. Sorry, I gotta back off. And so what happens is I still I have basic bank accounts and stuff like that, but just doing things like investments or anything that's a little bit more interest generating and stuff like that, it's a little trickier, because FACTA compliance, in the way that, basically the US government has kind of got every country on notice that if you have a citizen there, we need to know about all their money. So
got it.
Yeah.
What for you, I want to start with, let's start with the negative and we'll move into the positive, right? So
Sure.
like, what was the biggest challenge? I know you just mentioned things like bank accounts and other kinds of things, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
what was the biggest challenge in terms of you are, no, let me ask you this. Are you like all in on Portugal? Like, that's where you're going to live, that's where you're going to
We got that question a
retire?
lot. We got that question a lot. And it was funny. that for the first couple of years, right before COVID, we got, oh, when are you coming back? And then after 2 years, it was like, you're never coming back. And it was like, we never said that either. We're kind of like, as long as it makes sense, we're here. And it makes sense. It's made sense for 6 years. I could see that at least being for the future, but the world changes, et cetera. So we haven't necessarily made this permanent commitment one way or the other. Yeah. So yeah, I think that answers the question. But
Okay, yeah. I mean, no, the reason I ask is right. So establishing that, okay, so maybe you're not there forever, but your roots are down there right now. That's where you are. You aren't thinking ahead. So with that, like, what has been sort of the biggest challenge? And again, we were talking about banks and stuff, but what has been sort of the biggest challenge or adjustment that maybe you weren't anticipating, moving over there?
well, a couple things in the short term. This might be something that is familiar to anybody who's probably done big moves, even in country, let alone in another country. But we'd lived in the same house for like 18 years. And so you end up, gosh, you work in tech, and next thing you know, you get like a free t-shirt every week from some startup, and then you end up putting it in a drawer. And then all of a sudden, the moment that you have to move with 2 suitcases, you realize, like, I got all these t-shirts and I don't know how to get rid of all this stuff because it's all accumulated. So being able to streamline your life, which was a good practice, was actually a lot more work than I expected. In terms of, the things you accumulate and the hard decisions you have to make about what do you want to put in storage, what do you want to keep, what do you actually take with you. That was one thing. But some of the bigger things, also been a challenge, is true, is just even doing taxes, because like I say, I pay taxes in Portugal, I pay taxes in the US, and it's relatively easy to get people who do understand the tax system in the US and those in Portugal, but usually the twain never meet and essentially like understand how one kind of low, so you kind of have to like patch it together. And I know there's people who are specialists who do this, but we don't have the kind of estates that kind of warrant that kind of attention. The people who are doing, yachts in Monaco who would help us out. Yeah, so that's often just sort of a little extra detail dealing with it. But otherwise, in terms of extra challenges, I'm trying to think of what we had to face. I mean,
So I want to even something like going to the doctor.
The doctor, well, I'll say, here's the thing. I would liken adjusting to the culture here a bit. Like, and here the thing is that I'm not a big gamer, but it really does feel like a video game where you do these levels of unlock, right? So like you unlock this level and you're like, hey, I got a bank account. Hey, I've got a tax ID. Hey, and then, you get through all these. So it almost feels like you're a real sense of accomplishment when you actually achieve these sort of levels of bureaucracy, right? And so getting to know the medical care system is great here, though. So I do not miss the U.S. system any bit. I've had some issues in here, and I've gotten to know. It takes a little bit to know it. It's a little bit more oriented towards. You get to see these cultural things. They have these things called senyas, which are basically just like numbered tickets, and they pretty much run everything by that. And that includes whether it's like the equivalent of a DMV or whatever. It's like, and so you get into understanding sort of the protocol and practice, but it's also kind of cool because you get the cultural things, which I like, which is like, it is totally like common where you'll be sitting in a waiting room with Dr. Room, a bunch of strangers, and somebody come in and say, good afternoon. Everybody just says, good afternoon back. And you're like, this is pretty cool. So there's things like that I like, but the healthcare has been really good. And and it's also just, people just don't have the issue like in the US where they go bankrupt because of like healthcare costs. And it just doesn't happen. So,
yeah. So I want to flip that now. Instead of challenges, what was an unexpected sort of surprise then and a benefit that makes you go like, wow, this is really great?
Yeah, this is the funny part is, yes, the healthcare is great. Oh, one thing that was a real plus for me was I own a car pretty much almost all my life. And then moving to a city in Lisbon, being here for 6 years, it's not very practical in the city, even though we now have a place with garage, with 2 cars garage. But not owning a car, oh my God, does that help I mean, granted, you have to live in a place that actually makes life accessible, right? So you don't want to have to like walk 2 miles to the nearest, grocery store. But life here is really set up to not have a car, and just the weight of all that hassle and headache that comes with owning a car. It was funny. There was a speaker at an event, a kind of a future technologist type, who would use the phrase saying, "For the people who can afford not to own a car." And I'm like, that's an interesting way of thinking about it, and that's kind of what I've been doing. So we have like Uber and the equivalent here. They have Bolt and some other sort of services that you can kind of use for ride sharing. Mix of that with taxis, or certainly a good public transit system, buses and stuff. And it's been really good just to like be able to get around and do things. Unlike the US, though, there isn't the one-stop shop. So you got to like go for groceries. You're going to have to stop in 3 places. So it could take time, but you can do it all on foot. Um, Other things that I really kind of like, I'd say, well, in addition to sort of the continuous learning and that happens, particularly at, this stage of life, of having things to keep, engaging you and challenging you, which is good. One of the things that I really enjoyed are really simple things. This is the strange part. It's just it's part of it, I think, in Portugal, which is also true in Italy and some other particularly Southern European countries. There's a very much a work to live versus live to work kind of culture. And it's not to say I'm like taking my foot totally off the gas, but it is one where it's like, you've had your work time, but there's also a break, and it's like, now it's time to sort of, and it's simple things. Like I say, it's just, there's almost like a cultural idea here of just ideal of like having like a piece of grilled fish with your friends overlooking the beach, and you have like some Portuguese wine and watching a sunset, and that's like the epitome of life. And it's really cool. I'm telling you, it's like the stop and smell the roses thing. And so I really had a greater appreciation for that. It's a good slowdown thing. It's not an online thing. It's just one of those. It's just, and then socializing with friends and stuff. It's just really cool. So that's
Oh,
been a great thing.
okay. So as people are thinking about it, right? What's a first step you can, let's set aside research, right? Let's just say someone has
Right.
identified a country or a
Sure.
place that they want to move to. What's some practical advice people should consider? And this is not legal counsel or financial advice.
No, 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 no,
Uh,
no. We're
just
not
some
going
things that
there.
people should. I just want to make sure people know. I don't ever know when I need to throw out that caveat, but let's just
Fair
do it
enough.
just to be safe. So, like, what's the first step or a first couple of steps people should do, practically speaking, so that they could be better prepared for any such journey?
Yeah, I'd say that's a good question too. I mean, because I know a number of people who, some Americans, some others, who have kind of bought places in town, but most of the time rent them out and don't live here as often. And it's become more of like kind of a little bit more of a summer getaway than it's been sort of a main living thing. And it's a different thing. One of the huge things that I think that you have to invest in, and this is true in the US, relocating or anywhere else, is community, really. It's like, who are your people? Who are the people that, I mean, the neat thing about a country like Portugal is it's a people first culture, which is interesting because some people, it could be frustrating for business people who are trying to be very transaction oriented, but it's like, hello, how are you? How are you doing? Good day. It's all this stuff. And it's all this the greeting and stuff like that. And then it's like, then we can get to business. And because of that, you end up where, there's more opportunities for that social engagement. And that becomes, I mean, people are dealing with loneliness crises all over the world, but I think that's true whether that if you're going to retire down in Sedona, Arizona or whatever. It's like, how are you creating or finding your community to ensure that you have social structure and fabric, that you're not just dependent on a spouse or a boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever in terms of getting your full social input. And like, it's even worse, I think, for people who are doing a lot of remote work, is like, then they don't even have what I actually got to take advantage of, which is like getting to know people from work, shared cafeteria, and being able to kind of converse about the day's issues, learn about business, learn about just the local culture from an internal perspective, I think has been really cool. Just to kind of see what's important and how they perceive things. And they typically have the curiosity back and saying like, what's that like in the US? We hear stories, we've seen the movies. So, So that's kind of a good one too. I think to kind of I think the weaning off convenience is a good thing to think about. Um, the other thing is I think and I think one of the big shifts that for me was acceptable for where I was is I took a total pay cut to come here because I didn't necessarily get the quote expat package kind of salary thing where you hear stories of like, oh, if you're working for McKinsey or something like that. No, I actually ended up negotiating well, but still working in what was considered high Portuguese salary, which is really not much, not even compared to Europe. And I mean, like we end up at like the bottom 20th percentile of Europe, based on compared to everything else. So being in a position where if you don't necessarily are at a stage of your career or life that you feel like, oh, and I would say this is another thing too, and I've had younger people ask me about this, saying, "Oh, wow, I was at an event where I gave a talk to a small group, and a woman who came over from New York, and she's like, wow, and she has some Greek heritage, and she spent her time in Greece. She's like, I'm really getting this like European lifestyle thing. Is this good? And I'm like, well, it depends. And I think part of it is if you're at a stage in your life where you're still trying to like climb the ladder, get titles, be able to demonstrate, your career growth, it's going to be, I think, in general, a lot easier in the U.S. than it is here. It's a little bit more socially stratified. I was at a point in my career when I came here, I was like, title, who cares? I want to do just good work with good people, and enjoy and kind of make a difference. And with that orientation, it totally worked for me. But I think if you were doing it because you're trying to save up for your first house that you wanted to buy, or if you were trying to do it because you wanted to make VP by a certain age or something like that, then I think it's a harder sell, I think, in Europe in general compared to say the US.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, this has been wonderful. It has deepened my envy, not
Even all the complaints I gave you.
listen, I did hear the eating grilled fish looking over,
Oh yeah, it's
whichever
amazing.
body, the
It's
Atlantic.
sublime. It is
Yeah,
literally sublime.
I imagine. And then, heading up to what is it, to the big surf competition that they have up there, and
Oh yeah, Nazare. Yeah, I've
not
been there. It's wild.
the 100-foot
That's
waves.
amazing. It's crazy. Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, Greg Sherman, you are not only sort of a career technologist, but you are a man about the world. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom about living abroad with us. We
Hey, and
really
thank you
appreciate
for
it.
inviting me on this. Appreciate it.
All right. We'll talk to you later.
All right, take care.